So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you to everyone watching on Zoom. Thank you to everyone watching on Facebook, and for those of you who are watching back on YouTube afterwards. It's wonderful to have you here. So just by way of introduction, my name is Chris, and for those of you who don't know me, I am the editor of Bright Green. Bright Green being an online publication focused on providing news and analysis on the progressive social movements, the Labour movement and Green parties in the UK and across the world. Before we get started, just to explain a little bit about what this event is. So Bright Green has been beginning to host a fortnightly debate, bringing together people from across the left, people involved in trade unions, in journalism, in campaign groups. We're bringing together MPs and so on and so on and so on, to have debates and conversations about the biggest issues facing our world today. We're going to be having lots of those conversations this evening. A few bits and bobs of housekeeping before we get started. So for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, please do keep yourself muted. It will just make sure that we don't have interruptions to the conversation, and it means that everything can run as smoothly as possible. For those joining on Facebook, please do like the video, please do share the stream. It means more people will see it, we'll get more people watching this and join the conversation. That would be hugely appreciated. And of course, if you're watching back on YouTube, do like the video, subscribe to the channel, make sure that you share it around as well. The final bit of housekeeping in terms of what's happening this evening is just to say, please do tweet along on the hashtag being Bright Green Debates, and get the conversation going on there and get more people watching these in the future. A final plug before we get started and I introduce my panel is just to say that this event and the events like it that we're running are only possible as a result of the donations of our supporters. So if you do feel able, please do head to bright-green.org/donate. And for those on Zoom, please do click on the link in the chat. So without further ado, I'm incredibly excited to announce our phenomenal panel for this evening. So we've brought together an incredible collection of people, and I'm going to introduce them one by one before we crack on with our questions for tonight. So first up on our panel this evening, I'm going to ask you all to give me a little wave. First up on our panel is Grace Blakeley. So Grace is the staff writer at Tribune, the host of A World to Win podcast, author of Stolen and The Corona Crash. We also have, and I can see Grace is plugging the book there. We also have on our panel this evening Mary Bousted, who many of you will know has been campaigning hard around the coronavirus safety in our schools. Mary is the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. We have Larissa Kennedy, who is President of the National Union of Students. Nick Dearden, who is the Director of Global Justice Now. We have Anthony Slaughter, who is the Wales Green Party leader. And finally, we have Sonia Adesara, who is an NHS doctor, a campaigner, and a former director of 50/50 Parliament. Thank you all to our incredible panel for joining this evening. I'm going to go straight into our first question. So all of our questions have been sent in by people who've registered to join the call. And I'm going to go to Mary on this first. It's a simple question. Should schools be reopening on March the 8th?
Thanks very much. So my answer to that is yes, they should, but not like this. There are some good signs at the moment. So positive cases are down by 29% week on week. Deaths are down by 35%. Hospital admissions down by 22%. And the vaccination programme is the one success story of this government with COVID, although I actually think that is an NHS success story. And I had my vaccine, my first shot of the vaccine today, and it was a great moment. And I tweeted it and got lots of interesting comments about how I look without my glasses. So it's interesting what people take notice of. But there are some really good signs of the wind. But none of the other nations in the UK is sending all the pupils back on the 8th of March together. They are doing a phased return, and that's what SAGE, in its minutes of the 11th of February, said to the government. It said, if you just send everyone back, that has the potential to raise the R rate by 60%, by 0.6. That's the highest level, up to 0.6. Whereas if you take what SAGE recommended was that you start that with some years in primary and then you can see what effect that has. You know, by Easter, what effect does bringing back certain classes in primary, what effect does that have? And then you can see whether the mitigations you've got in schools and colleges, or in schools if you're in primary back, whether they are sufficient to keep the R rate down. Because remember, by December last year, secondary school students were the most infected age group, and primary school students were the second most infected age group. And all this, I mean, children are themselves much more unlikely to get COVID badly, for it to make them ill, because COVID is a disease which hugely disproportionately is dependent on age, about how threatening it is to you. But what they can do, secondary school students were 7 times more likely than any other person to be the first person infected in their household. Primary school children were 3 times more likely, and as a group, children aged 2 to 16 were twice as likely to be the first person to spread the virus in their household and out to the community. Now, we are seeing vaccination rates, you know, speeding up. Maybe by the end of April, we'll have all 40 to 49-year-olds vaccinated, but we're not vaccinating children, and many of their parents will not be in the early vaccination group. So the potential for spread from schools into the community is still there. It took Tory MPs from September to December to acknowledge that COVID could be spread in school and spread beyond school. Now, there is so we've argued for a phased return, so that we can have a sustainable school return, because the worst thing that could happen is getting all the kids back now from 5 to 18, because nurseries have been open, and then to start seeing rates of transmission rise in schools and to jeopardize that safe return. So teachers really want their pupils back. For many pupils, remote learning is a pipe dream. There's over 1 million young people and children in this country without access to a laptop or without access to the internet. You've got kids trying to learn on their mother's mobile phone data. You know, the NEU's given £1 million to Help a Child to Learn campaign, because when teachers do remote learning, say to pupils, go and get a pen and paper, they don't have them in those homes. The level of child poverty that COVID has uncovered is huge. And the place where children and young people are safest is school. The place where they learn to socialize is school. The place where they learn is school. And the place where they are actually paradoxically happiest is often school. So school's really important. So if it's so important, the NEU said to Boris Johnson, we agree it's important. We agree we want pupils back, but we want them back safely and we want them back sustainably. And we are very concerned that in going for this big bang, in bowing to the right wing within his party, he is jeopardizing a safe and sustainable school return.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to bring in Anthony next. So Mary mentioned then about the difference between the approach taken by the different nations in the UK. Anthony, you're obviously the leader of the Wales Green Party. So I wondered if you could reflect on I guess some of what Mary's just said, but also whether you think the UK government has been taking the right approach with regards to schools, and also whether you think the Welsh government has been doing so as well.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having us here as well. Great to be here. Yeah, I'm glad Mary mentioned the different nations. So that's taken the chip off the shoulder already. I don't have to have a little rant about it. It's different in Wales. It's devolved. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And in most cases, in most areas, the Welsh government has been slightly more cautious than the UK government. They haven't handled it as brilliantly as they think, the pandemic crisis, or as the public narrative, but they have been more cautious than the UK government, and credit to them for that. So what we're looking at in Wales is the next review of the situation is the 15th of March. So that's a week after the schools have all gone back in England. First Minister is hoping that he'll be able to send everyone back then, but not committing to it. And I think that reflects the more cautious nature of it. And Boris Johnson throws dates out at random, and then you've got that public perception and people get all ready for it and it's going to happen. But the other side of that, speaking to a lot of parents in the town where I live, they're frustrated because they can't plan that vagueness as well. And one of the other things that's possibly an issue in Wales is they're hinting that non-essential retail will open on the 15th. That's going to be one of the first things that they relax. And then parents are getting quite irate, saying, well, I can go to the hairdresser, but my children can't go to secondary school. And for all the reasons that Mary touched on about just how important school is. And none of us thought we'd be here a year later, still in this situation. So the damage that's been done is immense, and we do need to get the kids back to school as soon as possible. But I'd agree with Mary, it has to be, sending them all back at once is just reckless, and it's in defiance of the science, which is par for the course of this government. So I suspect Wales's more cautious approach will pay off. And my feeling in Wales that most people won't be going back until after Easter, similar to Scotland. It's been interesting, just quickly on the devolution aspect, it has been interesting as the year developed. It was a little bit of a shock, I think, to the UK government that the devolved nations actually took devolution seriously, and they did have powers. And you almost saw it here as well with the Welsh press conferences and briefings, which stood in stark contrast. Mark Drakeford couldn't help but look statesmanlike compared to Boris Johnson's blustering. But you almost saw Welsh ministers growing into the job. Suddenly they were standing up a bit straighter. They actually had powers and they were using them. But as I said earlier, they haven't used them as effectively as they could. But on the schools, I think they're probably more in the right direction than the UK government.
Thank you, Anthony. So I'm going to bring Sonia in next, but before I do, just wanted to remind people watching that you can tweet along on the hashtag Bright Green Debates and help more people see this. For those of you who are watching on Facebook as well, please do share the video, get more eyeballs on this, more people joining the discussion, comment on the video, and so on. So Sonia, you're, I guess, working on the front line of the COVID crisis at the moment. So what do you make of the government's approach to schools and the reopening and so on?
Yeah, I think the first thing, just about the question, schools were never closed. Right now, I think about 25% of primary school children are in schools, and children of key workers are in school right now. And then I think, the second thing to say is that, obviously, inevitably, children being out of formal education is going to be harmful to their education, to their health, to their well-being. And that should have been, keeping children in school should have been prioritised. And unfortunately, it wasn't by this government. And their repeated policy failures led to the virus going out of control, led to us having to close schools twice in this country. And in other countries that managed to keep schools open and keep the virus rates very low. So if you look at countries like Taiwan, South Korea, they've done both. So this is a result of the government not prioritising children and not prioritising keeping this virus under control. But the second thing, I completely agree with what Mary said, that it's not about, having a fixed, we need to be thinking about how we can open schools safely. And again, the government have ignored the advice of SAGE, also ignored the advice of independent SAGE, and just don't seem to be following common sense that quite obviously having a phased and controlled opening of schools makes more sense. I don't know why we're not doing things like having school kids go in maybe on alternate days. I think having 15 kids in a classroom rather than 30 obviously will will reduce rates of spread. And then there's other things that the government should be doing. So they should be ensuring that schools have adequate ventilation. Are they ensuring that children can be taught outside? Have they given schools marquees? Have they given schools, adequate funding that they can put extra heating in to keep the windows open? So all these really common sense things that we know we can do to stop the virus transmitting. And again, this government is failing and not doing the basics to help protect children and their families and also the staff in the school. And then the third thing that I want to say is that, I've heard a lot of people talk about, children's mental health and that being harmed. And yes, it definitely is being harmed, children not being able to socialize and being in school. But I just find it, some of the people talking about this, some Tory politicians talking about this, it sort of makes my blood boil a little bit, because actually we know children's mental health has been suffering for many years. Children's mental health services has been slashed of funding. We know that many children are having to, with serious mental health problems pre-pandemic, we're having to wait 6 months sometimes just to see a psychiatrist. I used to work in mental health services in North London. And in our mental health services, we had children from London who were being put into mental health hospitals in as far away as Yorkshire because there was no mental health beds. Many schools don't have access to counselling support. So again, here, it's just, I think think, you know, the Tories having words but not action, and if they really cared about the mental health of their children, there is things that they could have done and they could be doing, and again failing to do. And then just the last thing about, you know, I think the most awful thing that again we've seen this pandemic is how it affects those who are from the most deprived backgrounds and from poor communities in every way, and we've seen that again with education. And I know, and I see this because I work in quite a poor area of London, and you know, children, it's you have a very different situation if you are, you know, a single mum or you are having to work all day. It's very difficult, and as Mary said, you don't have internet access. We know that the impact of closing schools is going to be much greater on children from poor backgrounds. We knew this, again, it was obvious, but what has the government done about it? Why do we not have laptops for everyone? Why have they not secured internet access for everyone? So I just think this government, you know, it's 1 year on and we're having these same conversations, which I find really frustrating. I completely agree with Mary in the work that NEU has done in actually raising, you know, speaking up for teachers and for the children. And I think it's sad actually that both political parties seem to have been ignoring the trade union here. And it's sad for children who's going to face a long-term impact of that.
Thanks, Sonia. I'm going to bring in Grace next. So obviously all of our panelists so far have, I guess, given quite a bleak assessment of the government's performance and suggested that, you know, Sonia's last point there, that both main political parties have been ignoring the trade union on this, the NEU. Grace, is that an analysis that you share? I think you're still on mute, Grace.
Sorry. That's so classic, very embarrassing. No, so yeah, I do broadly agree with what Sonia was just saying. I mean, I think I understand the frustrations and concern of parents who are working full-time, often on low incomes with very little support, and who want and actually need to get their children back into education for a whole host of reasons. But there are so many ways to be able to, you know, meet the needs of children, meet the needs of parents, and also do what we have to really do, which is listen to teachers and make sure that they are going to work in a safe environment. I mean, that is just really just the basics of what you should expect when you're going into work. And it's really what trade unions should be doing when they are representing their members. And that's absolutely, I think, what the NEU has been doing throughout this pandemic. And it's what the Labour Party, which, you know, it's in the name, is supposed to be the party of organised labour, has, in my opinion, failed to do. We've heard, I think, a lot about the measures that could have been taken to alleviate the impact that school closures will undoubtedly have on the gap in attainment between children from different socio-economic backgrounds. There could have been a rollout of laptops, of broadband, and all of this could have been paid for in the place of the huge subsidies that have been given to some of the biggest companies in the UK. Whether those have been subsidies that have been granted by the Bank of England or through various different breaks and subsidies that have been awarded by the Treasury. It seems like, you know, the main priority of this government has been to make sure that, you know, accumulation, profit making can continue unabated without really ever thinking about the needs of not just children, but, you know, anyone living through this incredibly stressful time. Trying to work, trying to provide for their children, trying to keep a roof over their heads. One thing I would also like to say is I've been speaking quite a bit to DPAC, Disabled People Against the Cuts, and to lots of people within the disabled movement over the course of the last couple of months. And they are basically saying that what they are experiencing on the back of 10 years of austerity, which has been by various different United Nations departments, referred to as, you know, a massive breach of disabled people's human rights. We've seen disabled people basically dying in large numbers because of austerity, and that has only been exacerbated as the pandemic's gone on. And today DPAC did a kind of direct action where they were delivering letters to the Treasury of disabled people who had been basically struggling to make ends meet during the pandemic. They were things like, you know, I can't afford to eat and get the transport I need to get to my doctor's appointments, so I can have chemo, or so I can kind of, you know, just have the basic kind of healthcare that I need to be able to survive. And the Treasury today, when those letters were delivered, said, we're not going to take these letters in, we're not even going to read them. And I think that is indicative of the government's disdain towards not just disabled people, who, by the way, you know, make up about 20% of the working age population, but to all of the most marginalized groups in society. And, you know, that has been consistently expressed, I think, through so many different areas of policy over the course of this pandemic. And instead, the priority has been to, you know, get stock markets booming again, make sure house prices don't fall too much, and make sure some of the biggest businesses can continue to make money as they always have. So yeah, I think this question of schooling and the priorities that it signals is really just indicative of the government's wider approach to basically who gets to live through this pandemic.
Thanks, Grace. And apologies for those of you who are on the Zoom call who have just turned your cameras off. It turned out that I may have been accidentally broadcasting you to Facebook, so I've turned them off so that your faces are not broadcast the internet if you don't want them to be. And we'll just have our panel on. Never a dull day with technical issues. So I'm going to bring in Larissa on this next, because obviously universities and schools have faced similar issues in terms of the phasing of reopenings and in terms of the impact of coronavirus on them. So I wanted to bring you in, Larissa, to reflect on, I guess, your work in the NUS around safety of universities, but also this issue of when schools and universities should reopen safely.
Yeah, I mean, I think in regards to safe return, I very much agree with lots of the points that have been made around how irresponsible it is to do this in a full cohort, in a whole-scale way. But I also think one of the really infuriating things about government policy in regards to safe return has been the way that colleges are consistently lumped in with schools in a way that there doesn't seem to be a recognition of the different things that we're dealing with in these spaces. There seems to be this assumption that all college students are, you know, similar age to school students, when that's just not the reality. And, you know, there's going to be millions of college students impacted by that news, but it seems, you know, in terms of the public sphere and what the government's putting out, what the media wants to talk about, we're either talking about school children or we're talking about university students. We're very rarely talking about college students, huge proportions of whom are mature students. And so, you know, the assumptions that we're making about, you know, not being so seriously effective, of course, don't apply when you've got immunocompromised students, disabled students, Black and brown students who are disproportionately at risk, student carers who are then considering those who they look after, and so on. So there are so many implications here for not seeing schools and colleges as two separate entities that need to be dealt with in those separate ways. And I think that's been a kind of a perpetual exhaustion for us at NUS throughout this pandemic, that schools and colleges have been regarded as the same, when of course there are those differences there. And I think kind of another infuriation with this is this sudden care about the education of young people and of school and college students, when actually we've all been demanding an end to digital poverty. We've all been making recommendations around investment in the digital infrastructure that makes online learning truly accessible, and seen little to no avail around that, when we could have been seeing the equipment, the software, all of the other things that students, young people and adult learners have needed to access their education throughout this pandemic. So I think just a kind of perpetual frustration again, that there is this narrative of caring about students, of caring about education, of caring about learning, when of course that feels like a kind of quite thinly veiled facade for what is actually a move to get more workers back into in-person work, right? That's what's at the core of this. And so I think, yes, an infuriation on our part, but I'll try not to repeat too much of what's been said before, because I very much agree with the positions around, you know, how irresponsible this is, and how much better we could have done this return if it were phased, if it was student-centered, if it were worker-centered. And, you know, there's definitely things we could be learning from the nation's approaches. Additionally, you know, I think not only just across the UK, but other nations too have taken phased approaches and so on. So, you know, I think there are definitely better ways that this could have been conducted. And once again, it's disappointing to see a lack of recognition of what students, teachers, those in colleges are actually calling for, as opposed to just making some broad brush approach to schools, colleges, without a recognition of the lived realities of those having to respond to those policy positions.
Thank you, Larissa. And now I'm going to come finally to Nick before I check if anyone else wants to come back in on anything. So, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, the government strategy throughout has been completely disastrous, as everybody has said. It's been disastrous partly because they're tone deaf to anybody who's actually working in the real economy, but also because I think they're driven by a kind of laissez-faire ideology. I mean, a kind of leave it to the market, don't do more than you absolutely have to do. And I think they're driven by that because, you know, Boris Johnson and co learned this ideology in school. It was the ideology of the British Empire. It was the ideology which basically said, doesn't, you know, if millions of people have to die from famine, whether it be in Ireland or Bengal, well, so be it. It's probably better than us intervening in the market and disrupting the global economy. And it seems to me that this laissez-faire idea has driven them throughout, particularly some of their, you know, the more crazy backbenchers who they're definitely more frightened of than they are the death toll in the country, or even, frankly, in many ways, the economic consequences of all this. Because, of course, the problem with not acting has been eventually they've had to act too late in a really shoddy and incompetent way, partly because, you know, their party has run down the welfare state in this country for so many years now that we actually don't have some of the infrastructure to deal with a crisis like this. So they've handed it over to a bunch of companies who failed us again and again and again in terms of running our social services. And so on, and they've done it so late and so shoddily that we've actually faced worse restrictions than many other people in the world have. And I'm very worried about this repeating again. And this is not, I don't want anyone to get the impression that people on the left kind of love lockdown and so on. I'm absolutely desperate to get out of this situation. I don't even have it that bad, and it's absolutely awful at this point. And, you know, I do almost anything to get out of this situation. But I'm very, very worried about the history of the last year and more repeating again if we move without the proper infrastructure in place too quickly, without thinking it through, and you know, kind of the idea that we just throw it open and leave it to the market. The government's the one thing they've managed, which Mary pointed out back at the beginning, is the vaccine rollout. You know, they've done that fairly well, but everything else they've done has been a complete disaster. Airport quarantine, still a disaster. Test and trace, a disaster. And on and on and on. And I'm really worried that they've put everything now in this one vaccine basket. And, you know, that's fine as far as it goes, but all it requires is a strain resistant to that vaccine to come into the country, and we're back to square one, we're back in lockdown again. And they have not used this time at all to put in place, to rebuild the bits of the welfare state they run down, and to put in place the infrastructure that can get us through this and mean that we're safe long term. They've learned nothing from some of the East Asian countries, you know, where people are back in nightclubs and so on, because they've actually managed, even without the vaccine, because they've successfully managed test and trace systems in those countries. So I'm really worried. I think it's absolutely right, as does everybody, I think, to prioritise schools. Of course it is, for all the reasons everybody's spoken about. But I'm really worried that the way they're going about this threatens to get us back into this very situation that me, and I'm sure the rest of you, are desperate to get out of.
Thank you, Nick. So before we move on to our next question, I just wanted to pause briefly in case there's anyone who wants to come back in on anything that's been said. And in the meantime, just to remind people that if you're watching on Facebook, please do share the video. Let's get more people watching and more people engaging in the conversation. And you can tweet along on the hashtag #BrightGreenDebates. I can't see anyone looking like they're indicating they want to jump in. So I'm going to move over to our second question. I'm going to come to Larissa on this one first. So the question for you is there really a problem of free speech on our campuses?
I mean, I'll start with a very short answer, no, but we'll expand, I'm sure. So I guess a few points that I want to make. The first, that there's no basis for this claim that there's some sort of free speech crisis, and I'll go into that a little bit in a second. The second point I want to raise is that there is a difference between the right to speak freely and the right to a platform. And I guess a third point around this freedom of speech angle being pushed in a way that is very selective, and very selective to the narrative that the government wants to push. So kind of starting off with the lack of a basis for this. I really want people to understand that the free speech crisis is very much a manufactured crisis. It's statistically insignificant. If we look at the Office for Students figures, we can see that of around 60,000 events organised in the space of a year with an external speaker in English universities, this was for the academic year of 2019-20, there are 53 that weren't approved. So that's 0.09% of these events being not approved. And for each of those, there are individual reasons, be that security, be that very logistical reasons for why these couldn't be held. In many of the cases where they weren't held, they were actually postponed and moved and changed in order to accommodate. And I do want to stress the fact that this is a statistically insignificant issue. And an issue that's being misrepresented as well. There is this historical narrative about no platforming that perhaps existed when the ministers in question were at university in the 70s and 80s. I mean, I don't understand this idea that when a group of students perhaps invite someone, decides they don't want to hear them talk anymore, and that's being no platform, particularly when the people in question being no platformed have huge platforms and massive columns in some of the biggest newspapers, magazines, online spaces in the country. And I also want to stress that huge amounts of existent work goes into making sure that freedom of speech is upheld at our universities. This is ongoing work that has been embedded for decades to make sure that students have access to bringing speakers to campuses, of course, in less wild times, and to making sure that students can hear from a wide range of speakers, and that's available at universities. So just to really stress it in that kind of first instance, that there isn't a crisis in a very technical sense. There's not a kind of huge issue here, and this is very much a focus coming out of some of the most elite universities where there have been prominent cases, and a willingness to focus on this as a form of distraction from the fact that, you know, over the summer, this government lied to students, ignored scientific advice, lied to students about what was safely possible in order to entrap them paying fees and rent. But that's a whole separate issue, so I won't get too far into that. I guess a second point there around the difference between the right to speak freely and the right to a platform. And I think Nadia returned her reflections on this on Question Time were really, really important, because it was talking about how the measures that government are seeking to put in place here are going to be emboldening folks who feel like they haven't been given a platform to sue universities, and really questioning where we draw the line with that. And I think to kind of elucidate what's happening here, a considerable number of the speaker events that we're talking about are hosted by democratic student-led societies, and those societies invite speakers based on their mandate. So how do we then separate the right to freedom of expression from the right to students asking to hear what you have to say? And are we then saying that if students don't ask to hear what you have to say, you then have the right to sue the university because you weren't asked to have a platform? Where does this end? So I think that's kind of a crucial marker for me, is a lack of recognition of who is actually holding and hosting these events and inviting these speakers. And I think it's very easy to spin a narrative about no platforming when people maybe don't recognize where those speaker invites and so on are coming from. And then, as I said, that third point around a selectiveness in respect to freedom of speech, because I think this government does want freedom of speech until speech isn't something that they identify with. Because folks may have seen that over the weekend, the university's minister, Michelle Donnellan, made some pretty crude comments about the censoring of history within what she referred to as Britain's Soviet universities. And within those comments, she was denouncing the decolonization of education and talking about what a stain on kind of the curriculum and so on this was. And it actually feels farcical for the government to claim that there's a free speech crisis in one breath and then to critique free speech on the topic of decolonization in the next. And once again, it is a distraction. It's a distraction from everything that's happening to students. The fact that 9% of students have had to access food banks in order to survive this pandemic. The fact that we've got countless students in rent arrears, you know, over 55 universities where students have had to go on rent strike in order to have their demands heard. We've got so many students who are paying for accommodation in this country, but still residing in their country of origin because they haven't been able to get here. This is the situation we're in, and yet this government thinks it's appropriate to be manufacturing a freedom of speech crisis to distract from their inherent failures to protect students, to protect work, and to protect broader communities. And I think it's pretty embarrassing that they would stoop to such a low level of, you know, manufacturing this in a time where there is so much to be dealt with, so much needed policy and investment and so on, and wasting our time bringing forward a free speech champion. And I also want to make the point, I just think that appointing a free speech champion who will dictate what is and isn't free speech is very much a misnomer for me. So I guess just to round up there, the answer is overwhelmingly no. But that doesn't negate the fact that we are very much looking forward to working with government to explain how much actually happens to ensure that freedom of speech is upheld, because, you know, we're doing that all the time, and students' unions are doing that all the time. So I'd very much like to show them the kind of huge swathes of work happening in that regard.
So Larissa there has just described the so-called crisis of free speech as being manufactured, and I can see lots of nods coming from our other panelists. So I'm going to bring in Grace first on this. So do you agree with Larissa there that this is a manufactured crisis and there is no real crisis of free speech on campuses?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. To be honest, I think, you know, the like whinging about how X or Y or Z hasn't been invited to speak at X or Y or Z university would be the equivalent of like me having a strop on Twitter every year when I'm not invited to be the keynote speaker at Tory party conference. It's like, you don't deserve to be given a platform just because that you think you are, you know, the most important and relevant person that has the right to speak on this particular subject. As Larissa was just saying, you know, very eloquently and much more eloquently than I could, this is undoubtedly, you know, a very niche issue that affects a small number of very influential people who are basically aggrieved at the idea that there exists some people on the planet, you know, like, yeah, a group of people who maybe don't actually want to sit and listen to them talk for an hour, which is to them generally old white men, just, you know, something that must be explained by some sort of deep state conspiracy, rather than the fact that they're just utterly boring and irrelevant. So there's that. But I think it serves to kind of, you know, there's a reason that this has been manufactured. And I think, you know, it's kind of a broader part of this kind of culture war narrative that's deliberately placed at the front and center of our public debate by a media that's desperate not to talk about anything of relevance to people's real lives. So if we're, you know, if I'm on the Today programme or GMB every morning talking about whether or not people are allowed to, you know, whether or not we have a crisis of free speech because, like, I don't know, Douglas Murray was uninvited to a Cambridge debate, then we're not talking about climate breakdown. We're not talking about how we've had a decade of wage stagnation. We're not talking about how inequality has gone through the roof. We're not talking about the government has thrown huge amounts of money at big business during this pandemic and left others to kind of starve and without a roof over their heads. So yeah, I mean, I think it's manufactured outrage, but it's outrage that is manufactured by people who have an interest in making sure that we really don't talk about anything else. And for me, that's the real crisis of free speech in this country.
Thanks, Grace. And we certainly will be talking about other things this evening as well. We are going to now move over to Sonia, who I can see was nodding aggressively throughout what both Larissa and Grace were saying then. So over to you, Sonia.
Yeah, I just agree with Larissa. It's comical that, you know, and in the same month you have the Tories talking about free speech on campus, and yet telling the national, who are they called? The national something that look after buildings, I can't remember, National Trust, that they're not allowed to talk about the background of their buildings. So yeah, they really care about free speech. And yeah, I think this whole the woke war on campus. I was at uni about a decade ago now, and it was the same thing then. It's something that's they manufacture, they bring up every few years. And I think, you know, they do it, obviously they do it to flame the culture wars. But I also think they're undermining universities, because I think actually universities are probably, in higher education, that's probably the only few areas that are left of British institutions where you have radical thinkers and where you have left power. And I think that's why they keep trying to undermine universities. And then I also agree with Larissa's point that there is a difference between students organising events and academic freedom. And I think academic freedom on the left is something that we do need to defend. And it's something that is under threat. And it's under threat not because of culture wars, but it's under threat because of the structure of universities. And it's under threat because, you know, increasingly universities are marketized, you know, what's being researched is dependent on corporate donors. I have many friends who are academics, and it's really, really become increasingly difficult to get permanent posts. So, you know, you've got academics who have got, you know, insecure labor, who are low paid. So that is what's threatening, you know, academic freedom, not culture wars. And then I think, you know, the second thing, I want to touch on this sort of larger, bigger discussion about, you know, cancel culture and, you know, the free speech and Toby Young and all that. And you know, the truth is, cancel culture does exist, but it's always existed. You know, the only thing that's changing, and that's probably due to, you know, social media, that who is not being given a platform is changing. And but free speech is important, and I think sometimes, you know, the left are portrayed that they are, you know, against free speech, and actually no, free speech is really, really important. It's a really important right, as Larissa said. You don't have a right to have a platform, but you do have a right to express your views, and I think, you know, on the left we should be fighting for that. It's important that we allow people, even if they have views that we disagree with or are, you know, make us feel uncomfortable. It's important that we can have those discussions and critique those views. And I think, you know, actually it was Ronan who was on the panel a couple of weeks ago, said something recently which I thought was really important. And then he was saying that, you know, actually we need to be very careful on the left, and we need to have some really careful thinking about cancel culture and about this about no platforming, because actually at the end of the day, it is going to be the people who are challenging established norms, who are not following the conventional thought, that are likely to have their platform removed. So we need to be careful about that on the left. And I think I think there is a debate on the left about this, but I'm someone that generally sides on trying to, even when you don't like what someone says, I think it's important that we try and encourage that right to have people to say what they want, even if it's really irritating or annoying, because actually it is the left that will ultimately suffer if we promote this culture, which actually the right do, of only certain views being palatable.
Nick, I can see you were nodding there in agreement with what Sonia was saying towards the end about the left needing to recognise the importance of free speech. So what do you make of all this situation with regards to the allegations of a free speech crisis on our campuses?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to follow Sonia because I agree with everything she said. I mean, I do think there's a problem with free speech on campuses, but that problem is being driven by the government because they don't like the way that an awful lot of young people in this country feel and think about their history and the society that they're living in. And it's not just in universities. So, I mean, that point you raised, Sonia, about them attacking the National Trust, absolutely. The Culture Secretary just got a load of National Trust and other heritage organisations, very conservative organisations, demanded they had a meeting with them and gave them a dressing down about how woke they'd all become and how shocking this was. I mean, all the National Trust did was have a look at like which bits of the stately homes that it owns and manages came from slave money. Well, guess what? Almost everything comes from slave money, because that's where this country made its wealth. Slave money and the imperial exploitation that followed on from that. And it's taken us a very, very long time to get to grips with that. And now people are getting to grips with it and working out how it affects racism in our society today. But of course, that's, you know, absolutely anathema to the government. So it's them that's actually stopping people having these debates, having this discussion, exercising their free speech and learning about history. I mean, you know, the Charity Commission is another example of this. The person who's just stepped down, she was a former Tory Lord, and she was put in charge of the Charity Commission. I mean, she did the most extraordinary speech when she stepped down, you know, essentially saying that charity shouldn't go anywhere near any kind of political, divisive or controversial issues, like kind of fighting racism and talking about the history of this country. I mean, that's really a absolutely shocking attack on civil society's right in this country to stand up for those who have been oppressed, to help educate people, to empower people, to encourage debate. And that's where the real threat is coming from. There's a new planning proposal that's coming out of the planning ministry, where ministers will be able to overrule local authorities who want to take statues down or rename streets. I mean, it's just a shocking attack on democracy at all levels of society. And there's a great piece, actually, I just read now on Open Democracy by Sam Foles on all of this, saying, you know, we call it the culture war, but it's not really about culture. It's about politics. It's deeply about, you know, what kind of country we are, where we've come from, how we operate, and how we can change that. And I do think, I mean, going back to Grace's point, there is a reason for all this beyond the fact that, you know, the Tories don't like some of this discussion and debate that's going on in this country at the moment. And I think at the heart of that, Boris Johnson essentially built his power base and became Prime Minister and got elected on the basis of make Britain great again. And when many people who you know, they successfully gelled into this alliance in favour of Brexit, when many of those people realise what his policies actually mean for them in reality, which is not about making their communities better, not about making society better, they're going to struggle. And how do they deal with that? Well, the culture wars. I mean, that's how they shore up their base. That's their plan. Ultimately, they shore up their base through the culture wars. So I think that is why we've got to be really clear on all of this. The attacks on free speech are coming from the government, and of course, you know, I don't agree with everything that's ever happened on a student campus. I mean, that's kind of almost the point of student campuses. I remember the debates from when I was there, and it's a time when you can have, you know, debates that you wouldn't be able to have elsewhere in society. But let's put this in perspective. I mean, you know, even when I disagree with what's happening on student campuses, this is nothing compared to a government which is attacking our right to speak out, our right to organise, our civil liberties, the rights of local authority to take representative action on the part of people they represent. This is the real threat that we face.
Thank you, Nick. So I'm going to bring Mary in next. So Mary, Nick made the case there that this is a manufactured crisis for the purposes of shoring up the Tory base. Is that an analysis that you share?
I do, and I'd just like to carry on with what Nick said about the structures of government being to suppress information, to not answer questions, to really deny the flow of information. So the Information Commissioner's Office now, they've got a flagging system. So if you're a journalist, your question is delayed and delayed and delayed. You don't get the answer to your question. I just signed a petition about that. I'd just like to say three things. I think everything I would have said has been said, so I'll just say three things. When the Tories engage in culture war, the first question you have to ask yourself is what is it that they don't want you to talk about, they don't want you to think about? Because if they're engaging in this war, it is a massive distraction against what is the serious issues that they don't want you to think about what they did to the country during austerity. They don't want to think why people in the north in overcrowded households are getting so much iller with COVID, because there's no physical the physical infrastructure is less good, you know, is poor. They live in overcrowded accommodation. They've got their poor health, which is related to poor and low paid jobs. They don't want the people who voted Conservative in the red wall seats to think about those things. They want them to be angry about their lives, and they want a straw man or a straw woman to be angry with. And so culture wars are very, very good at doing that. Trump, par excellence, engaged in culture wars and did the big lie that I'm for the little man, whilst he was absolutely against the little man about doing anything for the little man or woman in terms of a minimum wage, in terms of recreating public infrastructure in America, about getting job security. So what do they want you not to think about? You know, and the second thing I would say is there's loads of organizations which are now springing up, which are fronts for this culture war. So for example, the Campaign for Common Sense. If you look on Twitter, the Campaign for Common Sense, when you look at what they're saying as common sense, it is thinly disguised right-wing propaganda, and they're trying to draw people in to say, look, people like us, this is how we think. But I just want to finish with what Nick said about freedom of speech, because unfortunately there are times when people are cancelled who shouldn't be cancelled. I was listening to Professor Selina Todd the other day talking about that she'd been a victim of cancel culture. She was just written a really, really interesting book on social mobility. We just can't allow that to happen. We can't allow that to happen, and we must ensure on the left, because we have to be much better about this than the right, because behind the right you've got the Daily Mail, you've got the Telegraph, you've got the Sun. I know what it's like to be monstered in those newspapers. It's happened quite a lot over the last year, and they're very powerful. The Mail sets the weather for much of the news reporting, much of the social media reporting, and they're on the lookout for this all the time. So the final thing I would say is, on the left, we have to be better at not giving them the opportunity, and so we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard than the right, a much higher standard, because they've got very powerful media organizations gunning for them all the time and creating the weather and creating narratives in people who don't have the time or the inclination to think too deeply about these things, so they believe them.
Thank you, Mary. So before I bring in Anthony on this, I just wanted to say, if anybody on the rest of the panel wants to come back on anything briefly, please do indicate that to me. But if not, I'm going to move now to Anthony to finish us off on.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, basically everything's been said. I mean, we all know, everyone in this room knows who the true enemies of free speech are in this country. And it is such an obvious distraction, the whole fake culture wars. And as it's been mentioned, straight from the Trump playbook, dividing communities, turning people against each other. And yeah, it goes back decades, this right-wing media that dominates everything, that has our mainstream politicians so sort of scared rabbits in the headlights, just too frightened to say anything. I mean, we've seen, it's been so obvious with Keir Starmer in the last few weeks, just desperately trying not to upset that section of media. And that's trying to win a battle that you can never win. We've got to be, as has been mentioned, we've got to be better than that. We've got to be stronger than that, and we've got to stand up. And I think there are two things going on. It is a distraction. It's used to distract from the realities and the things they don't want us to talk about. But I think someone else has also mentioned this. It is a certain section of society, and yes, white men of a certain age, I think some of them are becoming aware that they are losing control. They're losing control of the narrative, despite having the weight of the press behind them. People are talking about things. People are questioning things. People are taking to the streets. People are toppling statues. And it's making some people very, very uncomfortable, I think. But it's, I mean, we've got to look at when the Conservative government appoints a free speech champion. I mean, it's positively Orwellian. You just couldn't make it up. And the people that they're talking about, and it's been highlighted already how there isn't this crisis on campuses. But what we also need to look at as well is some of the other forces behind this. Nick mentioned, I think it's the same Open Democracy article about this, but they talked about the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, secretive right-wing lobbying movement with very, very dodgy backers. They're over here lobbying this government, and they've got a very strong anti-LGBTQI+ rights agenda, very strong anti-pro-choice agenda, and it's all been hidden in this sort of standing up for free speech. We're not being allowed to say what we want. So we've got to be very, very vigilant about that as well. It's not just the caricatures of the Toby Youngs and the James Foxes sort of throwing the toys out the pram because they can't say offensive things when they feel like it. But we also, one thing I would touch on as well, people are being denied a voice, but it's not the people that the media are talking about. I was on because we're in the run-up to the Senate elections, and I was on a youth-led hustings the other day, and one of the other politicians on the panel, I won't name names of parties, but has a very problematic record of saying anti-trans things in public. And it's a very good debate, covered lots of areas. And then at one point, someone asked about LGBTQI rights and young people. And a young trans activist on the call changed their profile picture to the flag with trans rights and human rights on. I didn't find out until afterwards, a sort of social media storm afterwards, that person was removed by the organisers of this debate. And this is a very good organisation that was putting this debate on, but there was that fear, I can only imagine, there's that fear of offending a politician. So that young person's voice was removed. So free speech is under threat, like people have already identified here on this panel. It's the free speech of the marginalised and the oppressed is under threat, not the powerful and the rich.
Thanks, Anthony. I can see Larissa's got a hand, so I'm just going to come to Larissa just to for some final brief, hopefully, comments on this before we move on to our next question. So, Larissa.
Very brief, I promise. I just think that was a really, really important point about the attacks on marginalised folks and marginalised students in particular. And I think it really does relate to Sonia's point about academic freedom, because this needs to be seen within the context of a government who have stopped discussions about or seek to stop discussions about anti-capitalism and Black Lives Matter in schools, and this being an ongoing trend. And so when we're seeing that kind of homophobic and transphobic agenda behind all of this as well, I just want to relate it to, actually, I want to read it. It was just really briefly a screenshot from one of the articles talking about this, and I just want to quote it because I don't want to get it wrong. But in a paper, Minister Dearden said that they were trying to defend our culture and history from the noisy minority of activists trying to do Britain down. And I just think that that quote is so indicative of what the agenda is here, because they see this group of folks who are standing up for their rights, who are standing up for the fact that generations of students, generations of young people have fought for the rights that we have today. And they very much see that as an attack on the status quo. And it is a doggedly, it's very pointed attack, and it's dog whistle racism, it's dog whistle transphobia, and it is so transparent. And I just wanted to kind of link those couple of points together, because I think it's really important to kind of knit the thread and see that these things are sewn into the fabric of higher education. Transphobia, homophobia, racism, and they're just unearthing it, they're bringing it out, and they know that it's so possible because it's always been there, and it's only through activism and organising that we've managed to get to the point where we are now. But yes, I don't want that to be rolled back because of this narrative and this rhetoric, so just wanted to briefly comment on that.
Brilliant, thank you, Larissa. We have just over 30 minutes left of this debate this evening. We have two incredibly large questions still to go. It's always the case that the ones towards the end get squeezed, but I'm going to encourage our panelists, if possible, to be a little pithier in their responses from now on, so we can get through those two questions. Before we move on to our next question, another reminder, just for those of you who are watching on Facebook, please do share the video, get more people watching. I found this a fascinating discussion so far, and I'm sure all of your friends will too, so make sure you share the video and make more people see it. So our next question I'm going to go to picks up on some of the conversation we had at the start of the call, and it's about vaccinations. So the question is, what would a just rollout of COVID vaccinations internationally look like? And I'm going to come to Nick on this first.
Thanks. Well, yeah, this is one of the main things we're working on at the moment. When we've talked about vaccination rollouts happening quickly and effectively, as someone said, I think thanks to the NHS in this country, globally, it's a very, very different picture. So when your starting point is 3/4 of all the vaccines that have been given in the world have been given in 10 countries, 130 countries haven't even sniffed a vaccine so far. There is what's being called vaccine apartheid. And surprise, surprise, when you look at a map of where the vaccines have happened and where they haven't, it's very similar to the old colonial maps. So at the very beginning, there were movements made by the World Health Organization to try to undercut this happening, to try and stop it happening. And they set up two institutions. One is called COVAX, which is all about trying to get the vaccines out as fairly as possible across the world. One is called CTAP, CTAP, and that was a kind of pool that was supposed to be about sharing patents, technology, know-how, so that scientists could collaborate, stand on the shoulder of giants, learn, see what other people are doing, and use that to create something better. Sadly, rich countries like Britain have utterly undermined these two institutions. COVAX they undermined by essentially saying, well, we're not going to get our vaccines from. It's very, very nice. It's nice for the rest of the world, but it's not good enough for us. We're going to simply buy all the vaccines before COVAX can buy any. And in that way, all of the first tranche of vaccines went to very rich countries, which is why the vaccinations have only really happened here so far. And then CTAP, which was supposed to be all about sharing and collaborating, well, the big pharmaceutical corporations, some of them based here like AstraZeneca, said we're having nothing to do with that. And so CTAP basically has no know-how to share, because the way that the medicine system works is we essentially privatize this research that's done by the public sector very often. I mean, what we now call the AstraZeneca vaccine is the Oxford University vaccine, which was originally supposed to be made without patents and whatnot. Then Bill Gates got involved, did a deal with AstraZeneca, and all of a sudden it's patented. And what we're finding now, there was a fascinating article this morning, is that you actually have factories that could be producing vaccines lying idle around the world. They can't produce it. Why can't they produce it? Because they don't have the property rights to the specific vaccines, because these are owned by a handful of enormous multinational corporations that by and large spend way more money keeping their stock price high every year, way more money on marketing, way more money on trying to extend their patents and challenge anyone who's using them without their authorization than they do actually researching the drugs that we need to keep us healthy. And it's not only a problem for coronavirus, it's also why increasingly we don't have any antibiotics to use anymore, because there's no profit in it. So we need a fundamentally new system. I'm really pleased to say that a number of countries led by India and South Africa are at the World Trade Organization today, trying to argue that we need to override the patent system, that we need to get out of the global patent system is called TRIPS, the Agreement on Trade-Related Intellectual Property. It was pushed by Pfizer and Big Pharma back in the mid-90s. We didn't have it until then. It's been a complete disaster for the whole world. It meant that when Southern Africa was going through its HIV/AIDS epidemic, even though we had the medicines to treat people in the world, people couldn't get hold of those medicines because they were too expensive and they couldn't make generics. This is the time to really challenge that system, and I think we can do it. So a better system is within sight. Most of the countries in the world are arguing for it. There's a few countries like our own that are blocking it. So I would just really urge people to get involved in the People's Vaccine Campaign and end this awful system. And it really isn't just an idea from some crazy activists over here. As I say, most countries in the world who don't currently have the vaccine are pushing for it. Our country, which has bought all the vaccines, is saying, no, there's no problem. You don't need this at all. But more and more people are getting involved. There was even a report by Tony Blair last Friday saying the market has failed us. We need a new solution to how we deal with medicine. So it's awful and it's obscene what's happening. But I think there's every chance that we can change it.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to bring Mary in on this next.
I have nothing to add. I thought it was a brilliant, brilliant exposition, and nothing I could say would match that. So I'm going to be quiet.
That's the pithiest of response we could possibly have. Thanks, Mary. I'm going to bring Sonia in next on this then.
Yeah, I think that was a brilliant summary by Nick. And I think, I think it's important that we sort of understand. I someone that tends to switch off when we talk about, trade deals and pharmaceuticals, but actually I've started to, I've been looking into this. I started looking into this last year when there was that discussion about, I don't know if you remember, the cystic fibrosis drug that was being denied. The NHS couldn't buy it because they couldn't afford it. And then I started to look at how corrupt our pharmaceutical model is. And most medical research receives a lot of public funding, and the vaccines have done. There's been, you know, millions of UK government put millions of pounds into funding these vaccines, and yet the pharmaceutical companies have exclusive rights over these vaccines. And you know, as Nick said, that they have due to these patent laws and due to intellectual property laws, they are refusing to share the knowledge of how they make their vaccines, and then they're able to operate these monopolies and charge, you know, extortionate amounts for these vaccines. And it's even, you know, even more, I think, it's really frustrating when, you know, we keep hearing that, you know, UK is celebrating how many vaccines it's giving to people. And UK, as Nick said, has then also, whilst doing that, undermined these global efforts to improve access to vaccines and get vaccines to poorer countries. So what Nick was talking about, you know, if we had a global access to patents, so if we force the pharmaceutical companies to share their knowledge about how they make these vaccines, then we can not only make the vaccines more affordable to poorer countries, but also massively scale up production. And there was a really good report that showed that if we had fair vaccine access globally, unlike what we have now, it would prevent 60% of deaths, rather than the current system, which is preventing less than 30% of deaths. So it's really, you know, I think it's pretty shocking that we, you know, again, like many things, we have sort of corporate greed that is, you know, corporate greed and, you know, just going after profit, costing people's lives here. And just the last point that I want to make about the HIV pandemic, because I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from the HIV pandemic, and actually we made a lot of mistakes with COVID, and the same mistakes that we did with the HIV pandemic. But in the, you know, as Nick said, in the you know, HIV was a death sentence, and then in the mid 1990s we had the miracle of antiretroviral drugs, which not only saved lives, you know, stopped people from dying from HIV, but it also prevents you transmitting the virus. So it was in the mid 1990s that we had these drugs and the innovation for these drugs. And yet for another 10 years, numbers of deaths globally from HIV continued to increase. And in 2019, and you know, the year before COVID, we had 1.7 million people globally acquire new HIV infections. So all of those infections should have been preventable. We have the science, we have the drugs there to prevent that. But as a result, again, of corporate power and corporate greed, and also their influence on governments, you know, we're still in this situation. But finally, you know, as what we can learn from the HIV pandemic, that it was activism and it was, you know, global solidarity and normal people on the ground who put pressure on the pharmaceuticals to lower their prices for the drugs. It took too long, but it can work. So I think that's something urgently we need to be doing right now. As Nick said, we need to be getting behind the people's vaccine and ensuring that, you know, people's lives are put before profit.
Thanks, Sonia. Grace, I'm going to bring you in on this one next.
There we go. Yeah, so I don't really have anything to add on the vaccine question other than what Nick and Sonia have just been saying, but what I do think it's really important to have is just some context, some kind of political economic context with regards to the situation in many of the countries that are struggling to access the vaccine, because we're not just talking here about countries in the global south who are going to be unable to afford the vaccine and therefore are going to be experiencing the effects of the pandemic for much longer. We actually need to be thinking about how already a huge number of states, some of the poorest states in the world, are in the midst of or on the cusp of a huge debt crisis, because we've seen the largest of outflow of capital that's ever been recorded out of the global south over the course of the pandemic. And, you know, for so many reasons, because of the kind of structural disparities and inequalities that exist within the global economy, because of the grossly unfair and really disorganized practices that kind of govern international lending and the international financial system. This is basically going to mean that some of those countries are going to be paying extortionate amounts of interest to their creditors. Others will be forced into some sort of negotiated default. In which case, you know, for example, after the financial crisis, when Zambia defaulted on its debts, what's called a kind of vulture fund, which is a, you know, predatory financial institution, bought up a load of its debts and then sued the country for failing to pay those debts and basically extracted millions of pounds from the Zambian taxpayer. This is the kind of stuff that we're going to continue to see as the economic impact of the pandemic worsens. You know, when we talk about kind of the economy and the global economy and macroeconomics, it's easy to kind of forget the link that exists between what's happening at that kind of quite top level and the lives of ordinary people. But basically what this means is that there are countries in the world who are being forced to make the choice between repaying their creditors, that's either banks, big financial institutions, investment funds, or wealthy states, and provide PPE, basic medical care, and just, you know, the public services that people need to survive to their citizens. That is the choice that some governments are being faced with today. Now, not all of those governments, even if they had the capacity, would be making the right choices. Some of them are, you know, very authoritarian. Some of them are, you know, quite corrupt, whatever. There are a lot of states with governments that are desperately trying to make the right calls here, to say, you know, we need to invest in decarbonisation because we're the states that are most at risk from climate breakdown. We need to make sure that we have adequate public health infrastructure. We need to make sure that you know, we are implementing policies that are going to alleviate inequality, because obviously the deaths have been hugely unequal depending on your socioeconomic background, and that's the case in the global north as much as it is in the global south. And these states have been saying for a very long time, even before the pandemic, we need funding, we need financing, we need investment to be able to tackle the massive challenges that humanity has faced. The IMF and the World Bank have broadly said, well, okay, you can have money, but if you do privatization, open up your capital account, and you know, cut all your subsidies that are being used to kind of provide, you know, food and basic stuff people need to your citizens. And we're seeing again a kind of a return to those politics of kind of structural adjustment that we really, you know, haven't seen at this scale since the 1980s of poor states relying on international financial institutions who then come back and say, sure, you can have some emergency support to be able to pay your debts, but in exchange, we're basically going to take over your entire economy. We're going to take over your macroeconomic policies. And so really the background to what's going on here when it comes to the vaccine is just imperialism. And, you know, usually when we talk about imperialism, we think about countries invading other countries, but actually more often than not, we see imperialism in a kind of political economic form, which is, you know, people who various countries aren't able to access vaccines because they're distributed to wealthy countries first, in which, you know, intellectual property is guarded very closely by multinational corporations that exist in the global north, in which it costs more to borrow if you're a poor country, in which it's impossible to industrialize if you're a poor country, in which it's impossible to decarbonize if you're a poor country. All of these are facets of imperialism, which basically suck wealth, power, capital from poor states into rich states. And that's the kind of structural context that I think we need to be looking at when we're thinking about the global recovery from this crisis. And the only real response to that is to say, you know, we need to have things like a global Green New Deal that involves resource transfers from global north to south, that involves technology transfers to kind of undermine these really just, you know, the horrific intellectual property rules that Nick was talking about, and that really is founded on solidarity rather than the kind of the competitive mindset that governs international relations, and particularly that governs the relations between the global north and the global south ordinarily, because ultimately if the poorest countries in the world don't recover, the rest of the world isn't going to recover.
Thanks, Grace. And some of what you were mentioning towards the end there around the Global Green New Deal, I'm sure will come up again in our final question. But before we move on to that, we've got two of our panelists left to go. So I'm going to bring in Anthony next on this question on the international rollout of the vaccine. Anthony.
Thanks. Not a lot to add, really. I think everything's been covered really, really well. I mean, solidarity is the key word. The vaccine solidarity, not vaccine nationalism, which is what we're seeing. And I think the COVID pandemic has just shone a really harsh light on our society, hasn't it? It's exposed horrible levels of inequality, both here, but also in this case internationally. It's highlighted things that, you know, we've all known about, we've all been talking about, campaigning on, but it's put it in really, really stark relief. And I think the references to imperialism are really important as well, because that's going to come up in talking about climate change. And we need to be looking at reparations, about righting historical injustices, so that the world is fighting this. I mean, this is something, the parallels of the climate emergency and the effects on some of the most vulnerable communities in the world are striking here. It is, do we come together as a community? Are we all in this together? And we're obviously not. And it goes back to something Nick said earlier about, well, you know, we've got a government that doesn't really care if 100,000 its own citizens die. So there is no connect, and it just really highlights the massive global inequality and the fact that there's a marketplace in this. The fact that people are making money out of this. I mean, I'm sure we're all on the same side in this. It's a really important campaign, and I think where it might be slightly different from others, you know, the climate crisis, the climate emergency, we've got governments that think they can put the barriers up. You know, we'll just close the borders, leave the climate refugees to their fate. But this is an international problem that if we don't fix internationally, none of us are free of it. So would like to think that that would drive a campaign, this very important campaign, and to make sure we avoid the situation in future. It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't, you know, the patents just have to be waived. It's obscene, and it's watching our governments, the sort of chest beating of that word, world beating, and we've got more vaccines than anyone else. It's abhorrent and says so much very negative things about our society.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. So I think I can see that Sonia wants to come back in, but I'm going to quickly go to Larissa first, and then I'll come briefly to you at the end on this one, Sonia. So over to you, Larissa.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to go really quickly. Being the last person, I think a lot of the points have been made. But, you know, obviously the neo-colonial, neo-imperial links here have been very well kind of brought to light. You know, it's ludicrous that we've got some countries amassing enough vaccines to sort out 2, 3, 4 times the size of their population, and then some of the world's poorest countries can't even get enough to vaccinate, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5% of their population. So that the kind of vastness of the gap is huge. And I think that's been really well covered. I think my only additional point would be in terms of conceptualizing what global vaccine justice looks like. Something I think we're not talking about the world over is the kind of complacency when it comes to incarcerated folks and the huge amounts of I forgot what the pandemic was called then, of coronavirus. I don't know, how could you even forget that when we talk about it all day, every day? The huge amounts of coronavirus contraction among the prison population, and how we kind of exercise tangible solidarity on an international scale with incarcerated folks who have been and continue to be left behind. And so I think that's kind of the only brief point that I wanted to make, and particularly that, you know, here, I think in England and Wales, it's something like 1 in 8 folks who are incarcerated have tested positive, and yet we're not seeing that kind of disparity reflected in the way that we're addressing the rollout of the vaccine. And I think that's a trend that we're seeing the world over, and it's highly concerning. And it really speaks to a broader biopolitical logic that comes into place when we look at the kind of makeup of prison populations. And so I think on the left, we need to do more to connect conversations about prison abolition and anti-racism and the kind of global vaccine rollout. But yeah, I'll leave it there in the interest of time.
Thanks, Larissa. So bring in Sonia for one final point on this, and then we'll move on to our last.
Yeah, just to say that vaccine nationalism, or like, you know, economic nationalism, as Grace put it, it's not only sort of immoral, but it's also really short-sighted, because if we allow the virus if we vaccinate everyone here, but allow the virus to rip in other countries, we will get mutations that are immune to the vaccine. And then we'll find ourselves in you know, back in the beginning. So yeah, it's cruel and it's immoral, but it's also stupidly short-sighted. That's it.
Thanks, Sonia. Thanks for your brevity. So we have 10 minutes left, and we've got an impossibly large question to finish on. So apologies to all of our panel, but I will encourage you to be as brief as possible so we can definitely finish on time. And our final question is, can we solve climate change under capitalism? And I'm going to head straight to Grace to kick us off on this one. Brief as possible, please.
Yeah, so this is a big question. I think, to be honest, the answer is yes, depending on your definition of solve, because there is a solution to the climate crisis, which involves basically global apartheid, in which we erect borders between global north and south, in which we kind of consolidate the you know, technologies and infrastructure that is going to be required to deal with climate breakdown in the global north, and allow large parts of the global south to basically find themselves underwater or desertified or facing so many extreme weather events that it becomes impossible to live there. And the reason that I say yes, that is a solution, is because there are some people who genuinely do believe that that is a solution. And I think it would be, you know, it would be just a bit, it would lack foresight to fail to bear in mind that there are, you know, people, very, very powerful people within the global economy who are already thinking along those lines. The far right is already thinking along those lines. Climate denialism has in recent years very much given way to climate nationalism. And I think, you know, as long as the left is saying it is impossible to tackle climate change within capitalism, there are going to be people who are going to come back and say, well, no, it is. It just requires basically certain lives to be placed above others. And that is, of course, the systematic logic that exists within capitalism anyway, that, you know, wealthy lives, white lives, certain kinds of lives have more value than others, and therefore we should invest more in protecting those people. So I do think that it would be possible to kind of create a world in which a certain number of people were shielded from the worst effects of climate breakdown, at least over the short to medium term. Obviously, you know, that is basically going to involve systematic social murder of a large portion of the population. So I don't think it is necessarily sensible for us to say we can't solve climate change for some people under capitalism. I think what the right line is that the only way to promote economic justice, climate justice, alongside kind of racial justice, international justice, is to develop a program that is aimed at alleviating all the kind of successive and interlinked crises that we are facing today. You know, the pandemic has drawn so many of these crises out. It's not simply the fact that we're facing global warming, which is just actually one element of a wider set of ecological crises that we are living through at this point in time. It's also that we're facing an epidemic of inequality, that actually, you know, trust and faith in democracy is incredibly low and is lower than it's been in a very long time, which basically kind of undermines our capacity to deal with a lot of these problems politically. You know, we're facing global housing crisis, right, which is something that, you know, we haven't really spoken about yet, but this is a huge factor both in the global north and also throughout the global south, where, you know, the financialization and commodification of housing has proceeded very, very quickly. There are so many deeply interlinked crises, and they all come back really to the fundamental logic of capitalism, which is the drive to commodify all areas of life, all areas of human experience. Everything that can be commodified will be commodified in service of capital accumulation. And that is the case with the natural environment, it's the case with people's lives, it's the case with everything. And really kind of imagining a different kind of society, imagining a world which I think is the kind of most people's common sense is the kind of world that they would want to live in, one in which we care for each other, in which we have solidarity for each other, in which we care for and have a kind of an attitude of stewardship towards the natural environment, where those values take precedence over this drive towards endless accumulation, which has given us a world in which, you know, millions of people are dying at the same time as Jeff Bezos has become just unimaginably wealthy, often on the back of actually, you know, state support that has come at the expense of interventions to support working people. So yeah, I mean, I think we could possibly imagine this kind of, you know, disaster capitalist response to climate breakdown. And you often see this in kind of science fiction as well, which is like, you know, the idea that we're all just going to leave Earth and go and colonize and then wreck another planet. But, you know, ultimately, I don't think that it would be any world that any of us would want to live in. And so really, we have a choice right now between, and I think this pandemic is a real turning point. We have a choice right now between a kind of disaster capitalist dystopia and recreating a world which places, you know, human life and solidarity and mutual care and care for our planet above the, you know, imperatives that exist within capitalism towards constant profit maximizing.
Thanks, Grace. I'm going to bring Anthony straight in on this one. So can climate change be solved under capitalism? Quickly as you can.
In 2 minutes. Yeah, it was slightly thrown to hear yes, but that was a really good response, because one of my favourite pieces of Green Party merchandise is a Scottish Green Party t-shirt, which just has the simple slogan, "It's capitalism versus the planet." And it is, I think that sums up what's just been said. It is that straightforward. We can't solve climate change, climate emergency with capitalism. Capitalism is the root cause of where we are now. And I think, yes, the techno fixes and the rich looking after themselves would be very short-term and very short-sighted. You know, we live on a finite planet, and that is the ultimate paradox. You can't have eternal growth on a finite planet. I think it was the Stern Review that actually said climate change is the biggest single failure of the free market that we've ever experienced. It is proof that the free market doesn't work. It's an extractive, exploitative system that cannot keep itself going. It will run out of people and resources to exploit. So we really do have to reimagine a different way of doing things. And it is about completely restructuring. You know, it's not about tinkering around the edges. It's not greenwash. It's not green capitalism. It's not adverts for electric cars where they have the strap line, leave the oil in the ground. And you just think, how dare you do this now? And it is about a complete new economic system. It's about what we value, how we live together. And it is about dismantling the free market and finding a different way of organizing our societies. I'm going to leave this call, and it's going to be messages from campaign managers saying, please don't talk about dismantling the free market in the run-up to an election. But I think we have to be brave about what it is we're talking about the world reimagining. And I think one of the things that just in the year before the COVID pandemic, one of the things that was really inspiring to me was watching different strands of the struggle for international justice and equality coming together. Watching the climate strike for action, merging with Black Lives Matter on the streets of Cardiff, watching this growing recognition that climate justice is social justice, is racial justice. We're absolutely right. We have to tackle all these things. We have to create an equal and fair world if we're going to have a future. And equality doesn't exist within borders. Equality is international and intergenerational, or it's nothing. So I would absolutely, in the interest of time, I could go on a lot longer, but no, capitalism is the problem. Capitalism is the root cause of where we are now.
Larissa, quickly from you, do you agree with Anthony's roundup there that capitalism is the problem?
Yeah, I'm going to try and the problem. I also agree that white supremacy is the problem. I think, you know, Grace spoke to those kind of eco-fascist solutions that have been bandied about. I also think, you know, we saw a lot of the response to the pandemic being like, oh, the earth is healing without people around it, and seeing that narrative seep in there as well. And actually, rather than, you know, interrogating the capitalist motivations behind how we are producing the issues with the planet and the way that things did, you know, we did see that kind of shift when lockdown first hit, and you know, there was very much not use of public transport nor cars and vehicles, etc. How do we shift the conversation from, oh, earth is healing, and kind of eco-fascist lines around what is happening, to people understanding that it's the kind of inherent motivations of capitalism to make us you know, extract and utilize resources in a way that is contrary to our survival. So no, like climate justice cannot happen under capitalism, but it also can't happen under white supremacy. I also think, just to kind of really quickly contextualize the kind of microcosm that we're seeing with this in universities, like UK universities hold over £15 billion in investments. A lot of those investments are in spaces that are caught up in the arms trade, in climate injustice, and all of this stuff. And I think, you know, as a microcosm of that, we can see that these things aren't possible. They cannot be convened. They cannot be reconciled, because the interests of the wealthy, the interests of the folks at the top, the interests of people who want to see those economic relationships continue are always going to scream louder, are always going to amass more noise, unless we collectively resist that in a way that speaks to liberation, not just for ourselves, but towards climate justice, racial justice, economic justice, all forms of social justice in the broadest possible sense. So yeah, just to sum up really, really quickly there, really very much agree with a lot that's been said, and this is not possible under capitalism.
Thank you so much, Larissa. So it's 9 o'clock, but I'm going to squeeze in our final three panelists. Apologies, I'm sure you've all got a huge amount to say on this, but I'm going to ask you if you possibly can.
I'm really sorry. I have to go. I've got another.
That's absolutely fine.
I've got to say goodbye, but it's been really good to be with you all, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mary.
Thank you.
And for your contributions. So really quickly, in 30 or so seconds, if we could, I'm going to bring in Nick first and then Sonia for the final word. So Nick, as quick as you can.
Yeah, well, I mean, the global market system that we've got, I mean, incentivizes the most short-termist, selfish, pathological behavior imaginable. I mean, it doesn't just allow people to dig up the last bit of coal and chop down the last tree. I mean, it incentivizes it, it rewards it. And so the idea that you can just hand over the solution to climate change to the market is a nonsense, just as handing over many other social problems to the market is a nonsense. And, you know, Polanyi talked about this in the 1940s, that eventually it would lead to fascism or, you know, serious social breakdown. So we've got to constrain the market in our economy. We've got to roll it back, and you can do that in various ways. You can do it, first of all, by just simply removing whole sections of decision making from market mechanisms, like we did with the NHS in the 1940s. Let's rethink the public sector and just remove whole sections of our society from market mechanisms. Let's think about different economic models that don't depend upon endless growth, like co-ops. Where we do have a market, let's strongly regulate it in the public interest. All of these things have been tried before in relation to the market, you know, coming to dominate our entire world, the entire global system. It's happened before in the 20th century, so we can do it. But certainly the way that the solutions being posed by some of our leaders at the moment, i.e. more trade, more growth, more markets, is absolutely not going to work at all for a just climate solution. So you know, let's campaign. If we're allowed to Glasgow at the end of the year, let's make sure we're there demanding not just some lifestyle changes, but a fundamental change in the way that the international economy works.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for your brevity. Finally, Sonia, the last word for this evening, over to you. You're on mute, Sonia, sorry.
Last word. So in the decades that we've known most about climate change, and we've understood the science, and we've understood that it's going to cost lives and livelihoods, we've put the most carbon in the atmosphere. So no, I don't believe market-based reforms are going to achieve this. As you know, Larissa said really well. If we think about capitalism and colonialism, the underlying logic is that we extract resources and exploit people to pursue profit, and this is the same logic that drives climate change. So I agree with what everyone else has said. Climate justice is about understanding that we need systemic change, and this needs to deliver social justice, economic justice, and racial justice. And otherwise, if we don't do that, as Grace said, we'll see the far right take up this space. So yeah, the answer to the question is no.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sonia, and thank you to all of our incredible panelists, and for everyone who's been watching throughout on Facebook, everyone who's been watching on Zoom, everyone who's watching on YouTube. It's been incredible to have you all here. Massive apologies to my chairing and my inability to keep to time, but I have found this an incredibly fruitful and insightful conversation, and I hope you all have too. I have just a few final plugs to make before we wrap up for this evening, so please bear with me, and I'll get through them as quickly as possible. So the first thing to just do is just to say, as I did at the beginning, this event has only been made possible by generous donors who make Bright Green happen, who make our articles happen, who make these events happen. If you were able to, it'd be hugely appreciated if you were able to make a donation to Bright Green to make more events like this happen, to maybe get me a timekeeper so that I don't run over on these events. There's a link to the donation page in the chat on Zoom. It's bright-green.org/donate. The other thing to say is that we have our next of these debates taking place on March 16th. We've got another incredible panel, including Rosie Sexton from the Association of Green Councillors, Chris Saltmarsh from Labour for a Green New Deal, Josiah Mortimer from Left Foot Forward, and many, many more. Again, if you're on Zoom, the details are now in the chat. We have another event though before that. We're having a live streamed interview with the Industrial Workers of Great Britain and the United Voice of the World Trade Unions about worker solidarity and organising within the pandemic, which is going to be on March 9th, same time as always on a Tuesday at 7:30. The details for that are again in the chat on Zoom, and they'll be in the comments on Facebook. And finally, you can make sure that you don't miss any of our events, any of our articles, and anything that Bright Green are doing by following us on social media. You can find all the links to our social media channels on the chat, in the comments on Facebook, and in the description on YouTube. Final thing for me to say, and I know I said finally before, is if you are watching on YouTube, please do like, share and subscribe, get more people watching these videos and more people taking part in the discussion. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you to our incredible panel. It's been a wonderful evening and I will see you all soon. Thank you.